Hello and welcome to the course Introduction to the Psychology of Language. I am Dr. Ark Verma from IIT Kanpur and we are in week 5 of this course. In this week we will talk about various aspects of sentence processing. In the last week we discussed about words, the week before that we discussed about speech. Now once you kind of know what to do with words, once you know how a word is understood in terms of its form and in terms of its meaning, what is the next remaining task for you to accomplish with as far as language is concerned? With children or with adults, if you are learning a second language that late, one of the things that you start doing after getting a sense of the words is to start combining those words into phrases and sentences. The idea is that you need to be able to combine all those individual strands of meaning into a whole which kind of is capable of communicating a message. Now these combinations obviously occur through a number of rules that are specified in the grammar or the syntax of the language. In sentence processing, we are going to understand how does the syntax of the language kind of play a part in us being able to communicate very complicated messages, and also for the listeners or the readers in order to understand whatever is being said. See, there has to be a bit of consistency between what I am saying and versus what you are understanding. The underlying rules of language, unless they are the same for both of us, unless they are consistent for both of us, you will not really be able to understand what am I saying, and I will not be able to communicate what I intend to. The whole chapter on sentence processing is kind of going to revolve around those points. In today's lecture, we will probably understand about what a sentence is and some of the intricacies regarding processing of sentences, and in the lectures after there, we are basically going to talk about parsing. Now parsing is basically one of the ways in which you kind of attempt to understand a sentence by understanding its underlying structure and so on. I will go on, I will talk about parsing in more detail in the later lectures. So let us start today's lecture. Let us start the first lecture on sentence processing by understanding one of the things, one of the most basic questions: what exactly is a sentence? Let us try and take an example, and I hope that example will be able to help you understanding this. Now there is this quote, I am not sure whether it is by Marx himself, but this is an interesting quote. Just read this. It says, "Time flies like an arrow, fruit flies like a banana." Now if you have to understand the second sentence and you are going to use the first sentence as a cue, obviously you will land in the wrong quarters. Time flies like an arrow is a metaphor. It says that time flies and it flies like an arrow would fly, that is all right. However, fruit flies is not the verb. Flies basically refers to insects fly, and the idea that is going to be conveyed here is fruit flies, those insects that kind of hover around fruits like a banana. Okay. So this is something very interesting, and you can kind of if I were to show you this one after the other, what probably you will take a cue of is you will probably try and read the first sentence as is, and because the first sentence is already going to establish certain expectations, the reading of the second sentence might sort of rely a little bit on how you have read the first sentence. Also you will see that there is a sort of a local context here. You would not, I mean, as soon as you talk about fruit flies, you already start understanding, okay, what is it. However, understanding fruit flies in the first instance, in your first reading of the second sentence, after if you have read the first sentence, can kind of go a little bit wrong. However, if I were to present the second sentence to you in isolation, I am not sure that a lot of ambiguity will remain. Now this is interesting in the sense that these are pretty much the same words. I have just changed a couple of words here and there, and it changes the entire meaning. Also the same words can actually play different roles in different sentences. So the same word flies is a verb in one sentence versus it is a noun in the other sentence. So this is something to kind of demonstrate the intricacies of processing sentences. Let us move further. So as I said, what happened in the example, organization of words could lead us to understand or misunderstand the given message, and this is basically what sentence processing is about. You have to understand what are the underlying rules using which a particular structure, a particular phrase structure or sentence structure has been organized. So that is basically what we will try and understand. So How can we define a sentence? A very simple definition would be that a sentence could be looked upon as an organization of meaningful words according to the grammatical rules of the language. So, if you can take some of the words, some of the meaningful words of the language, obviously all the words are meaningful, you do not really have nonsense or gibberical words, but if you kind of take all of those words and you combine them using a particular structure following a particular set of rules, that is when you will be able to create valid grammatically acceptable sentences, and that is what will be able to communicate whatever you intend to communicate in the best possible manner. So, that is what the definition of a sentence is. Now, we know that speakers systematically organize the sequences of words into phrases, clauses and sentences. When listeners try to comprehend those sequences, they have to determine how the sequences of word is organized and use this information to recover the meaning from whatever the speaker has said. So, as I was saying earlier, unless the speaker and the listener are on the same page, unless the rules basically of the language are equally well understood and they are consistent across situations, it will be very difficult to achieve successful communication. Further, when language scientists try and study sentences, they are actually interested in how is this organization coming about. How are people organizing words into these structures while they are speaking on the go. So, that is something that is very interesting to say, for example, all the scientists who want to understand language comprehension, particularly the psycholinguistics and the linguists. So, both of these people, linguists more from the perspective of how a language is particularly structured independent of the user, whereas psycholinguists basically are more concerned with, say, for example, how a particular user, given their own unique profiles, are using language in a more or less uniform sort of a way. Also, psycholinguists and linguists are interested in what cues the listeners use to figure out how words and sentences relate to one another, and these cues, understanding these cues basically becomes vital, enabling listeners to recover the speaker's intended meaning. So, we are talking about a scenario where, say for example, you are saying that whatever structures that a speaker is uttering must have some hidden cues in terms of rules, in terms of, okay, this is the agent, so agent must be doing something and it should come at the head of the sentence, those kind of things. So, some of these cues basically need to be picked up by the listener in order to successfully recover the speaker's intended meaning, and these cues are also object of great interest to both linguists and psycholinguists in order to understand how language comprehension really works. Now, this organization of words into sentences, or say for example the organization of how these cues will be informative as far as language comprehension is concerned, basically broadly comes under syntax. So, the study of syntax basically involves discovering these cues that languages provide that show how words and sentences relate to one another. Also, the other related phenomena is that of syntactic parsing. Now, syntactic parsing, as I was mentioning earlier, it involves discovering how are those comprehenders or listeners using the cues to determine how the words in the sentences uttered by the speaker are organized or related to one another. So, is this an agent and this a patient, or this is the agent and that is a patient? If it is active voice sentence, passive voice sentence, what is the noun phrase, what is the verb phrase, all of those things we will see unraveling before us in a quick bit. But all of this kind of comes under what is referred to as syntactic parsing, which basically refers to understanding and thread bearing a particular sentence and its structure. Let us take an example. Now, there is this sentence, I am borrowing some of these examples verbatim from Traxler's book chapter Sentence Comprehension, so as to we can kind of stay on the same page as far as these structures are concerned. And most of the and all of these examples are actually in English, but yeah, bear with me and understand how this probably might work. Okay, so there is this sentence: Dr. Phil discussed sex with Rush Limbaugh. Now, this sentence, depending on my reading, or suppose if you are reading this, you are not listening to this and reading this, might have one or two meanings. Let us look at them. Now, if somebody asks you what did Dr. Phil do, and you could basically give one of two answers. Dr. Phil discussed sex with Rush Limbaugh, so sex is the topic of discussion. On the other hand, what can be what is the other interpretation is Dr. Phil discussed sex with Rush Limbaugh. So, basically it could be that the point of discussion was sex with this particular person. Now, both of these things are basically arriving from the same organization of sentences, and the whole idea is that you kind of the sentence is open to multiple interpretations depending upon how you organize the words in the sentence. If you see here the way I have broken this, you will see that the pause is taken at different places. So, sentence 1, the pause is taken after the word sex, and in the second sentence the pause is taken before the word sex, and that kind of changes the organization and also the understood meaning of the sentence. Okay, we are not sure of what the intended meaning is at this point, but obviously for a particular listener this kind of changes the entire interpretation, alright, and this is obviously, as said, possible within the same sentence. That is why it is very important to get these rules very correct, so that the speaker exactly gets the listener exactly gets what the speaker is intending to say. Now yeah, so just kind of looking at it a bit more closely, one of the likely intended meaning happens when readers treat the prepositional phrase with Rush Limbaugh as being closely related to the verb discussed, which is the first instance. So this meaning would fall out of the following hypothetical. So this basically you can kind of look at the first sentence in this kind of a conversation. So somebody might be asking, who did Dr. Phil have on his radio show this morning? He had Rush Limbaugh on the show. What did they talk about? They talked about sex. Dr. Phil discussed sex with Rush Limbaugh. So this is the first interpretation, whereas with Rush Limbaugh is basically attached to the word discussed. So the main the action is basically the act of discussion, and that prepositional phrase connects Rush Limbaugh to this particular this particular verb. However, in a different conversation, say for example in a different conversation, it could be that the sentence involves treating the prepositional phrase Rush Limbaugh as being closely related to the noun sex and not the verb discussed. Then basically the conversation would be something different. Say for example, the question could be, okay, so who did Dr. Phil have sex with? Dr. Phil has sex with Rush Limbaugh, and then it could kind of move further. So you could see that just a little bit of a mistake, or say for example because the sentence is ambiguous, both are acceptable grammatical ways of understanding the sentence. Both are and the sentence is perfectly grammatical as it is. So the idea is, this is what one would need to understand. This is what we will need to kind of pay a little bit more attention to, is how do we organize this set? Where do we put this prepositional phrase? Depending upon where do we attach this prepositional phrase, you are seeing that the meaning is changing drastically. So it happens so many times that we take comprehension and understanding language so casually, but this could be this could serve as a very good example of that if you do a little bit of a mistake, you kind of could lead to the meaning to completely somewhere else. So this is something that we would want to look at. Now just look at something else. We have talked about phrase structure at some point, say for example when you are talking about knowledge of phrase structure with respect to developmental acquisition of language. Now we will kind of revisit that, and phrase structure is typically how do you organize words into phrases. So the idea is that words first are organized into sub particles called phrases, and then phrases kind of can be combined together into forming sentences. So a phrase could be a whole sentence in itself conveying the one single idea, or it could basically be combined with another phrase to create a longer, a more complicated sentence. So that is what phrases are, and one of the ways in order to understand how phrases really work is by drawing these phrase structure trees. So you can see an example right here. If there is a sentence, usually a sentence would comprise of a noun phrase and a verb phrase. Let us take an example. Say for example, you can and I'll probably, before going to the example, let us try and understand what the phrase structure tree is about. So you will see the phrase structure tree, there are labels like noun phrase, verb phrase, and S which is a sentence, and these labels are referred to as nodes, and the connections between them are called branches. So you see the lines that join S with NP and S with VP, and also then NP with Dr. Phil, all of these are called branches. the patterns of nodes and branches basically shows how the words in the sentence are grouped together to form phrases and clauses, and it is according to these branches that we actually organize our reading of the sentence and our meaning making of the sentence. So, in the sentence first, Dr. Phil discussed sex with Rush Limbaugh. The leftmost noun phrase would be Dr. Phil, and then discuss sex with Rush Limbaugh can come later. So, you can see the organization could start happening like here, subject, there is a noun phrase, there is a verb phrase. In the noun phrase, obviously who are we talking about? The main head noun of this whole thing is Dr. Phil. So, we kind of keep Dr. Phil as the first part of the noun phrase. The meaning with that conversation 1 kind of expresses involves discussion of sex with Rush Limbaugh, and that kind of can be expressed through the phrase structure tree that is depicted right here. So, you can see Dr. Phil was the first noun phrase, and then you kind of breaking down the verb phrase into the main verb is discussed, and then you have discussed sex with Rush Limbaugh. So, this is basically what gives you the meaning out of the first conversation. You see that discuss becomes the main verb, and then within that remaining part you have a noun phrase and a prepositional phrase. So, verb phrases can also be kind of broken down into noun phrase and into a verb and another noun phrase. If however you would want to take this to discussion and to the conversation 2, Dr. Phil discussed sex with Rush Limbaugh. In that conversation you will see that the phrase structure tree would kind of evolve slightly differently. The noun phrase part will remain the same, but you need to look at this one and the earlier one that I showed. You will see the phrase structure tree becomes slightly different. You see here the verb phrase can be divided into a verb and a noun phrase, wherein noun is the sex and prepositional phrase is kind of attached with the noun sex. So, you see discussed sex with Rush Limbaugh. So, this is basically kind of giving a very different reading, and the meaning obviously is completely changed. So, you can see how to and I am just going back, you see 4, the organization is different. Here the noun is not attached with the prepositional phrase, whereas in the second conversation the noun is kind of in the same tree as the prepositional phrase and is kind of attached to it, and both of these kind of lead to different meanings. Moving ahead, this is how the first conversation would look like. So, Dr. Phil discussed sex with Rush, and Dr. Phil discussed sex with Rush Limbaugh. This is one sentence, and the other one is Dr. Phil discussed sex with Rush Limbaugh. So, basically the reading kind of changes, you can see the phrase structure kind of changes, and this is what kind of leads us to understand how the conversation moves. Now, this was just I think a very basic primer into what we will be talking about in the coming lectures, basically about how parsing could work, and this was just a very simple example of how parsing really might work. Now, we saw a little bit of an ambiguity here, but people are generally kind of interested in ambiguity because they are interested in understanding where the sentence comprehension or sentence production process might break down. So, let us take one more example, and this example is, say for example, while Susan was dressing the baby played on the floor, or while Susan was dressing herself the baby played on the floor. These are two sentences. If you read the first sentence, while Susan was dressing the baby played on the floor, or you could read it like while Susan was dressing the baby dash played on the floor. So, there is a gap there. However, if you want to really disambiguate it, you will probably insert a word there, and it should start hearing like while Susan was dressing herself the baby played on the floor. This is non-ambiguous. This is how you disambiguate that particular sentence. Now, researchers basically are interested in these globally ambiguous sentences. Those basically, so globally ambiguous sentences are those that have sequences of words that can be arranged in more than one way, and each of the possible way is grammatically acceptable, grammatically consistent. However, each of these different organizations could lead to different kinds of meanings being formed. So, that is basically what globally ambiguous sentences are, and usually what is observed is that this kind of global ambiguity leads to longer reading time. So, when readers are going through these sentences, mostly when in isolation, mostly the comprehension accuracy kind of comes down, reading time also kind of I am sure goes up, and brain patterns also kind of show a different kind of activity. On the other hand, there could be temporally ambiguous sentences, wherein there is this certain sequence of words that can be configured in more than one way, but overall if you look, there is only one grammatically correct way. So, for example, this is not really a lot of problem, because as soon as you start organizing the sentence into different manners, you will realize that okay, only one of them is grammatically consistent, and you will probably go with that over the other forms. So, this is called a temporally ambiguous sentence. A globally ambiguous sentence can be organized in many ways. Most of all of them are grammatically acceptable. A temporally ambiguous sentence can also be organized in many ways, but only one of them is correct. Okay. So, let us look at this. While Susan was dressing, the baby played on the floor. While Susan was dressing herself, the baby played on the floor. So, the first one is an example of a globally ambiguous sentence, while the second one is an example of this temporally ambiguous sentence. Now, people when they were made to read this, they found more difficulty in processing the sentence around a verb played. So, it was people were probably facing problem as to where does this verb played get attached to. So, let us look at and why this might be happening is basically what happens is one of the guiding principles, one of the heuristics that people use in reading is called the immediacy principle, and the immediacy principle is people do as much interpretive work as they can based on partial information and make possibly incorrect assumptions rather than waiting until they have all the information. So, what happens is as people are reading sentences and they are kind of creating structures, they do not wait for the entire sentence to come and then organize the sentence into structures. What people do is they start with say for example, Dr. Phil discussed sex with Rush Limbaugh, they will already okay, this word has come, this is the noun, and then they start attaching words to it. So, because they do not really wait, a lot of times people kind of end up with correct interpretations, with incorrect interpretations and incorrect assumptions, leading to ambiguity in meaning. It basically also indicates that making structural choices in itself is not really very difficult. You can be doing this on the fly. What happens is when people have a lot of these different structures possible, they might sometimes choose the wrong structure. So, when Susan was dressing the baby, who played on the floor. So, this can lead to a ambiguity and wrong structure, while say for example, if you put it like this, when Susan was dressing, the baby played on the floor. So, this second kind of structure is more easily understandable. So, if the person would have kind of waited and not attached the baby to dressing already, then played on the floor, played could be attached to the baby, and the thing could have been more easier to understand. Okay. So, following the immediacy principle, people usually do not really wait till the end, and when Susan was dressing, the baby came and they attached the baby to dressing, that could kind of lead to this kind of ambiguity that we saw here. Now, just look at the sentence structure, phrase structure of these two sentences. You have while, which is a complementizer, does not really play a very important role here, but you see while Susan was dressing the baby is one sentence, and dash played on the floor. So, now you have this dash which is an anomaly, you do not know what is playing on the floor. This is the incorrect assumption. Why has this resulted? Because you have attached the baby to Susan was dressing. So, the idea is you kind of thinking that Susan was dressing the baby, and then you do not know who is playing on the floor. That is kind of leading to this anomaly. However, if you reorganize the sentence, what you would do is you will say keep while there, while Susan was dressing in one sentence and the baby played on the floor in another sentence. So, you know who is playing on the floor, and Susan was dressing is kind of alright, and it is kind of understandable that Susan probably was dressing herself. Okay. So, that kind of can lead to multiple interpretations. Now, this is just a very brief, very superficial exercise on understanding what is going to come next in this chapter. We are going to deal with more and more of these structures, basically trying to understand how is it that people are organizing these. Are they following some foundational principles? What kind of foundational principles are they following? And we will see on the fly that what different kinds of structures can result with different kinds of principles. How do we understand what rules to apply where? Do we actually need those rules? Do we actually process and parse these rules? This is basically what we are going to cover in the rest of the week. So, the take home message for today is that yes, it takes a great deal of processing for a sentence to actually start making sense, and if you commit a mistake here and there, obviously the sentence can make very different meanings, and the speaker might not be able to convey the intended meaning in the first place. Thank you.